Satsitla, and a new one that somebody just mentioned to me that I should include is Pache. So, and it's so wonderful to and important to keep on learning about the traditional territories in which we're living in and continue to build relationship, not only with the people, but the land itself. And I know many of you are on this journey, a very similar journey as well. If it's your practice, if you would like to put your land acknowledgement into the chat, that would be wonderful. What we're going to do today is have a conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we'll go into small groups just for a few moments, maybe 10 minutes or so, just to kind of sort through what you heard, what stood out for you, and then we'll come back into the larger group for a more general conversation and asking questions and that sort of thing. But you will have a chance to voice your land acknowledgement when we go into small groups if you would like. So in a few moments, I will introduce Len, and then he will also add his own introduction as well. But we wanted to take a moment by way of protocol and custom, and for a lot of us have been on a journey of incorporating two-eyed seeing in the way we do things. So blending together, Western understandings of thing and ancient knowledge, ancient indigenous knowledge. And so sometimes our protocols might be very cultural based on, who we are and the event that we might be at. And other times we bring in Western understandings and of things like mindfulness. And so that's what we thought we would do today, is just to utilize a practice that we've talked about before in these sessions. And I'm sure many of you have heard from others utilizing this process of helping us to slow down, helping us to be mindful of where we're at in this moment, and kind of turning our gaze inward and looking at ourselves and being mindful of where we're at. Many of us have come from very busy days, and maybe you have other busy things to do after this session as well. So it's often a really good practice just to slow down, and in some ways empty our minds as best we can. And really, for indigenous ways of knowing and being, that's what ceremony does for us. That's what protocol does. It helps to empty our minds somewhat. It helps us to be aware of ourselves and each other so that we can learn with one another and be there for one another, make important decisions together, and maybe even sort through conflict and maybe hear some difficult things. And we do that from a place of an open mind. It's just so helpful for the process. So we thought we would utilize the STOP technique that many of you have experienced before. And STOP is an acronym. And so I'm just going to get us to take a moment to literally stop. And I know, like I say, many of us are running from other meetings and other experiences. So let's just take a moment to pause, to stop and pause, and to almost have kind of like a cessation of action and reaction, and just be present in the moment. And we want to create a space where kind of emotionally and mentally we can engage in this present moment. So that's what the S in STOP stands for, is taking that moment just to pause. And the T in STOP stands for taking breath. Sometimes people will say, take 3 nice deep breaths. I like the number 4, so I often say, take 4 deep breaths, but just be very mindful. And you can do this right now in this moment. Do what's comfortable for you. Take in some nice deep breaths and notice the experience of taking in that deep breath. And as you're releasing it, notice how it's flowing from your mouth or from your nose. Maybe even extend the exhale a little bit longer than the intake. So just take a few moments to take a few deep breaths in and out, and I'll do the same thing. As we move to the O in STOP, it stands for observe. To notice your feelings that you might be having in this moment. Maybe you're coming from an event or something that has you heightened in emotion, perhaps, or maybe you're coming from a experience of being calm. Just notice going on for you in terms of your emotions within your being, and also whatever sensations you might be having in your body in this moment. You know, whether it's that you're tired today or maybe elated. All of us are carrying different things in this moment. Just notice where your body is at. Maybe even do a bit of a body scan, starting with your feet and noticing how they're resting on the floor, or maybe you're standing. And notice any feelings in your lower legs, in your calves, maybe coming up to your knees and your thighs. Just notice what's going on in your body. Take the time to feel what's going on. And as we move into our abdomen, and notice any sensations within your belly, your ribs, maybe inside your chest. Just notice those things. And a lot of times, if we're dealing with stress, we feel it in our shoulders, and you know that's where I feel it often, and maybe even in our backs and our arms. And I know for me, sometimes my hands feel a certain way when I'm stressed, and maybe they feel a bit stiff, and I can tell that that's in a moment of stress when I'm feeling that. And then when I'm relaxed, I can feel how they're relaxing in the moment. And then our necks and our spines and the base of our heads and neck and inside of our heads as well. Maybe even in our scalp, faces, eyes, ears, mouth, nose, lips, all of those things. Just notice what's going on for you inside your body. And another good thing to observe is the room around you. Take a moment just to look without judgment, to look around the room and notice, you know, the light fixtures, the color of paint on the wall, maybe where the walls come and meet the roof, meet the ceiling. Notice things that are around your desk. Maybe you have pictures of loved ones or pets, things that you cherish. For myself, I always have stones around my desk. So I'm noticing the stones, and I'm picking one up now and playing with it in my hand. So just notice those things. And some people recommend even looking behind you, because sometimes when we're feeling agitated and stressed, sometimes we're in fight or flight, and so it might feel like we're being chased. But if you look behind you, you'll notice just, you know, what's around you, and that there isn't anybody chasing us. So it just helps us to be calmer in this moment. And then the P in stop stands for proceed. Proceed mindfully into this next moment. Proceed mindfully into this time that we're sharing with one another, and where we get to hear from the wonderful Len Pierre. So we're looking forward to that moment, and I think it's time to move into that moment now. So thank you for participating in that mindful exercise. It's my pleasure to introduce Len Pierre. I've known of Len for many years, and we connected probably about 2 years ago now, and we travel in similar circles. I always hear about Len's work that he's doing, the amazing work that he's doing all across the province and other parts of Canada as well. So Len is Coast Salish from Katsi First Nation. He's an educator, a consultant, and a TEDx speaker, social activist, change agent, and traditional knowledge keeper. His Western education is from Simon Fraser, and he has a master's degree in education, focusing on Indigenous curriculum and instructional design. And his experience includes Indigenous education and program leadership from various organizations across colonial Canada. Yeah, I'm just going to say again how much I appreciate Len and the work that he's doing and the reputation that he has for the amazing work that he's doing. Very relational in the way that he does things, and helps people to see what's going on in this world from an Indigenous perspective, that helps us to strive to walk in culturally safe ways. So with that, Len, I'll turn it over to you for whatever introduction and protocols that you would like to do in this moment.
Hi, Chika. Thank you so much, Harley. And I just want to receive your very kind and good words, and I reciprocate that. Having followed in many of the same spheres and circles as Harley, we never get to spend enough time in the same virtual space or just physical space. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity to sit and work alongside you. And thank you for opening us up with the stop. I was noting down each of the acronyms, and I really appreciate that pause. For myself, it's been one of those marathon days, tumbling from one meeting into the next. I really appreciating that grounding and calling us in to be present. And hello to you all. It's all very nice to meet each and every one of you. My name is Len Pierre. My ancestral name is Palikuluk, and I'm Coast Salish from Keetsi First Nation on my father's side and Musqueam First Nation on my mother's side. I'm the owner and CEO of Len Pierre Consulting, and I'm zooming to you live from my home territory of Keetsi, located in what is colonially known as the city of Pitt Meadows. And I'm coming to you this afternoon with an open heart and an open mind and hope to be received in the same way. I come in peace. I come in unity and solidarity for the good work that you all do. And I'm really here to be a community member. I'm here to be an open book. And I'm really here to, with the spirit of support, in supporting this conversation and getting anything that any one of us might need out of it within our shared time here. Um, at Len Pierre Consulting, we're a very new consulting group. By no means are we masters or leaders in this area or experts. We've been doing this for about 3.5 years. I've been doing this for about 3.5 years. When I started Len Pierre Consulting, it was me all by my lonesome working during the pandemic. And at that time, I worked for two full-time organizations, the First Nations Health Authority and the Fraser Health Authority. Um, Today, I have 25 Indigenous and non-Indigenous consultants who I get to work alongside at LPC, who are out there in the world at this very moment, engaging in very similar conversations that we will be engaged in this afternoon. And yeah, I just want to be very transparent with my intentions. That's one of my protocols in my culture is after we do the territory acknowledgement, and that's a tool I will offer you all. Is often when you do a territory acknowledgement, you can follow up with being very transparent with your intentions. My intention is to help hold a space for a safe space for knowledge sharing, conversations, storytelling, and just being together in unity and solidarity for this good work. And again, I'm here to be a support person, a coach, a cheerleader for the good work that you do. I welcome questions at any point in today's conversation, and I know that we'll have some time for that as at the end as well. So those are the intentions that I have for my space and one of the protocols that I wanted to share with you all. So hi, Chika. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Len. That's so wonderful to share that intention, and it really does reinforce the way that we were thinking about today, and recognizing how much we learn from conversation, being able to have dialogue with one another. And so that's what we thought would be a good thing to do today, is to have for you and I to start off having a bit of a conversation. And then, as I mentioned, we'll go into small groups so that you can have some conversations in that smaller setting. And then we'll come back into the larger group and have a big old conversation where questions can be asked, and experiences can be shared, and ideas bounced around. So we're looking forward to that moment. But why don't we get going with the conversation? And the first thing that we thought would be helpful to hear is based on, especially because of your experience in the healthcare world, especially working for First Nations Health Authority, an Indigenous run organization, and then working for Fraser Health as well. For you, what are the foundational principles of Indigenous cultural safety and humility? And one thing I know about you, Len, that I really appreciate how you talk about the journey and culturally safer spaces, that it's a journey. We can't just all of a sudden create cultural safety. It is a journey. And so I appreciate your phrase of culturally safer spaces. But I'll turn it over to you to share the principles that you feel are important in the work.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the principles that we always bring into, especially healthcare spaces, is the principle of practice, not perfection. And that's really often a hard concept for us to grasp in the corporate Western world. Often we are driven by our sense of perfection, especially if you're a leader. Leaders, educators, communicators, anybody who holds space, often we are driven by our sense of perfection. And I feel safe in this space here, so I'm gonna be very transparent with you all, and I'm just gonna say it. Is that what I've come to learn is that perfectionism is a value of colonialism. We talk about the perfect processes, the perfect products, the perfect land, the perfect, things, but in the indigenous worldview, we really strive towards balance. Mother nature, as human beings, we are not perfect. We are very complicated, complex creatures. And we really try to, utilize the teachings of the world around us. And this is where I come to this principle of balance also being a really great tool that we can use as professionals in our tool belt. We know that's the law of the universe around us because Mother Nature is not perfect. I mean, in many ways, Mother Nature is perfect, but it really is more of an endeavor of balance more than anything. Because where you have summer, you also have a winter. Where you have the sunshine, you also have the nighttime. Where you have birth and life, you also have storms and death and deconstruction of Mother Earth. So I really encourage professionals to look beyond and try to overcome their sense of perfectionism in this regard, in cultural safety, in reconciliation, and in decolonization work, because it's not going to be perfect. Um, Another principle that I often encourage folks to think about is how the work of cultural safety and reconciliation is really long term. It's intergenerational work. Um, and I say that's such an important principle, especially in the Western world, because so many professionals think that this work is about intensity, that we got to do it, we got to take down these systems of oppression overnight, and we're going to wave our magic wand and do all this great work, and it's going to be great in a year's time or 5 years' time. So I say that, this is a journey, not a destination. It's a practice, not perfection. And we're really in it for the long haul here. Um, Consistency is the zone of transformation, and that's where the work will really transpire. It's important to know that colonialism did not happen overnight. Colonialism in Canada was very strategic, very intentional, and over a long period of time. So our work in cultural safety and reconciliation has to be equally strategic, equally intentional, and over a long period of time. And First Nations Health Authority brought cultural safety over from New Zealand in 2013, 2014. But it's only really been hardwired and encouraged at a systemic level in the last 3 years because of the In Plain Sight report. So it's relatively new work, and these are early days. And embedding cultural safety, really needs that next principle, which is the principle of intentional. We need to be very intentional with this work. Um, if you work with Indigenous nations, clients, staff, and colleagues, there's always going to be this risk of, oh, well, this is tokenistic, or this is performative, or this is superficial work. And that's okay. That's natural step in the process. That's a natural part of the process, is to be met with that type of questioning. But the way we get around it is to be incredibly intentional with this work. That's why I always use, the territory acknowledgement protocol, but I always back it with being incredibly intentional with where you're at in your cultural safety. And if you want to do this work, your first step is to understand your own why. Why are you here? Why do you want to mobilize cultural safety into your practice or throughout your team or your institution? If you find your why, that and you're intentional about it, you're going to be magical on this journey. You're going to be solid in navigating the tides of change and transformation, because you'll always bring yourself back to your intention. And that's very aligned with Indigenous ways of being and doing and knowing too. Talking about a two-eyed seeing is to be never losing sight of your intention. Our elders remind us of this. Our matriarchs remind us of being very intentional with the work that we do. Because when the tides change and the road gets bumpy and the road gets the waters get choppy, if we bring ourselves back to our intention, then we might not be distracted later on in the journey. Other cultural safety principles that I really live by and offer is the principle of being transparent. Transparency is also an incredible Indigenous cultural value, especially if you come from some of our coastal nations. In our coastal nations, we are often longhouse people, big house people, clan-based people. Decisions were rarely, almost never made behind closed doors. And when I work with professionals, some professionals I work with, they're like, I love working with Indigenous people. There's no bullshitting with Indigenous people. And I'm like, that's because we're transparent. We're very transparent. We will, tell you exactly what we're thinking and what we're feeling. And so transparency, I'm always saying, is important at a systemic and institutional level, is just be transparent. Being transparent and exercising your humility on where you're at in your learning journey or your journey towards transformation, then you're going to find a lot of engagement and validation from working with Indigenous peoples. So those are a couple: intentionality, transparency, practice, not perfection. Those are some of the top ones that come to my mind.
Well, thank you so much. That's wonderful. Um, I wonder, because you're so um, involved in this work, every day. Um, there's it seems to me that emergence is something that's important to this work as well. There's the creativity and innovation that comes from being vulnerable, from being transparent, from being intentional, from knowing your why. Um, and then things come up that you sometimes never thought would come up, and a lot of times they're exciting things too, especially when you see them, when you practice them and you see them working. It becomes quite exciting. I wonder, for you, what are some of those emergent, exciting things that you're noticing, where you're at in your journey at this point in time?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, well, there's a lot of things. And I think that's so important, especially in the context of healthcare. There's always going to be emerging things. I would call them priorities. They're very important things that come up. So if you look back to the pandemic, that was a very high priority, and that will steer away. Crises will always steer us in a different direction. But not just crises, very wonderful pieces of work, very exciting pieces of work. Another emerging focus has been the work of equity, diversity, and inclusivity. Incredibly exciting pieces of work that have been a long time in the making in this country. But I find that has sometimes been, easy for some organizations to think that, oh, Indigenous culture, that's a part of diversity and inclusivity too. So let's put cultural safety in the context of EDI work. But they are two different initiatives, two different strategies. Other things come up like technology and media. I know technology and technological advancements can be distracting sometimes. Other social justice movements, what are incredibly powerful. There's a whole host of things. So this is why I say, if you ever want to get around those, if you don't want to lose sight of your focus, if you don't want to be distracted with other competing priority areas, the way you get around that is to be incredibly strategic, to forecast and plan for an ever-changing landscape, and constantly revisit your strategy that you have as an organization. That's a beautiful tool of a Western world, is pulling from strategic wisdom, right? Being incredibly strategic in this work. That's how you get around the superficial aspect of the work too, is when you embed it and you plan it and you measure it over a longer period of time. But cultural safety, in my mind and in principle, is a standalone item. It's very much aligned with the principles of equity, diversity, and inclusivity, but they're not the same thing. They're quite different in nature.
And I think another um, a big piece of this work is the connection to the journey of truth and reconciliation, as you've mentioned. And again, after since the calls to action came out, many structures and systems within BC are trying to embrace the calls to action. And in a lot of cases, we've been at it now for a few years. What there's the emerging things that are coming up, but then there's also some frustrating things. What are some of those frustrations that you're noticing, and not only for yourself, but for the organizations that you work with? Kind of like what are they struggling with as well that you notice, and maybe helping some organizations to work through some of those struggles? But what are some of those things that you're noticing?
Yeah. So there's a as a part of the changing landscape, which when I say that, I'm saying the shifting landscape of this society that we're currently living in, Canadian society. It's worth noting that there's a shift in our political systems right now, right? Do you all feel that? Do you know what I'm talking about? There's this shift in, we're coming into a political season. And with that, there's some very loud, big personalities and lots of strong vocals that are being brought out and shared. And it's been my sense that something that I haven't always seen, but I feel and I sense growing in some geographic regions and just some areas is this growing divide in our communities. And sometimes that really kind of is disheartening to hear or see, especially at a micro level. If you think about your townships and your cities, with that growing divide, there's been this emergence of denialism with a lot of talks for cultural safety and reconciliation. It's just been in the last couple of years where I've heard about people denying that the residential schools even existed. One of the municipalities in this province, one of their spouses, one of the elected officials, one of their spouses was, caught handing out flyers saying that there was no such thing as the residential schools, that it's all a big hoax. Um, Another city, another municipality in this province, had a group of people, non-Indigenous people, who grabbed shovels and pails and went out into residential school lands, wanting to find these so-called, missing Indigenous children and unmarked graves at the residential schools. So this denialism has been a really big distraction, and that worries me. That worries me for um, the divide, the divide that I feel like is going on, or the vast amount of misinformation that sometimes people can come across because of media and how information is so easily accessed today. So that's been one that's been a really big one that's been sticking out to me. Other things, another big one that I often find with many of our corporate clients, because we don't just work in healthcare, we work with all the sectors in Canada. We have clients in education, government, social services, the justice system. We work with every sector in Canada. Another big one that we find is a problem area is people that don't think that systemic racism exists in Canada, or Indigenous peoples really, don't need a special initiative, or it's cultural safety for all cultures. And I'm like, no, no, Indigenous specific cultural safety and humility. But often I find that's just coming from, again, misconceptions and assumptions that we live in a multicultural society. And Canada's not a multicultural society. It's a society of many cultures. There's a really big difference between those two concepts, right? To imply that we live in a multicultural society means that, we speak, 12 different languages, that we pray to 7 different deities, and that we, really immerse ourselves in a sense of multiculturalism, but we don't. Um, I mean, an example of that is if you just look at our statutory holiday system in this country, is our statutory holidays, our paid time off, is that reflective of all the holidays that the many cultures, call Canada home? No, because they're reflective of Christian holidays. So, this idea of multiculturalism and there's no such thing as racism in Canada has been a really big conceptual barrier for some organizations. But through education and training and a little bit of time and some coaching, we've really been able to overcome those barriers and those hurdles.
Yeah, very nice. Thank you so much. So a question that we often hear. Oh, and one thing I wanted to mention too, just thinking about this group, RTVS, when we were talking about creativity and innovation. I mean, that's this group is all about creativity and innovation for the way that it does its work. Um, but a question that we often get from healthcare providers is what are some things that you can do? What are some shifts? What are some actions you can take? What are some of those practices that are helpful, especially when you're engaging with Indigenous patients and clients or communities? What are some of those things that are helpful for healthcare providers to keep in mind when they're entering into those spaces where they're working with Indigenous people?
Mhm. So I have like a handful of what I call cultural safety tools that I'm always offering, especially folks who work in healthcare. And one of the biggest cultural safety tools that is my favorite and has transformed my practice and transformed the way I see myself in the world is training myself to um, ask myself, how am I being prejudiced in the work that I am doing? And it sounds easy. It is. It's simple. It's not easy. The word prejudice, just like racism, gets such a negative connotation in this country. Often, if you put the word prejudice on the table for discussion, you're gonna get this like uneasy. People's shoulders start to go up, and they're like, "Ooh, where's this gonna go? What's he gonna say?" Because it has such a negative connotation. Often it looks like where people, even healthcare providers, because I know I coach them, say, well, prejudice is bad. To have prejudice is to be a bad person. I'm not a bad person, so I do not have prejudice. That's typically what we gravitate to as an assumption. And that's for every professional domain in this country. What we're failing to educate ourselves and hold ourselves accountable to is the fact that prejudice is natural, it's innate, it's inside every single one of us as human beings, and it is 100% impossible to be without prejudice. Prejudice, by definition, are just internalized judgments about other people's cultures. Um, and we're only born into one cultural framework. Some of us are lucky if you get born into 2 different cultural frameworks, but most of us are only born into one cultural framework. That's your mom, meets your dad and they get together and they have you, and usually they're from the same culture. So when they're raising you, you're born into a singular cultural framework. So it's only natural that when you meet people from other cultures around you, you're going to have judgments about that culture. It's only human nature. So we need to stop asking ourselves if we are being prejudiced and start asking ourselves, how am I being prejudiced in the work that I am doing? How am I being prejudiced towards patients or clients or community members when they look differently than me, sound differently than me, behave differently than what I do back at home? If you can train yourself to ask this question on a daily basis, how am I being prejudiced? That's the essence of humility, owning and recognizing that you have those prejudices and those biases. If you can be humble enough to recognize that, and it will change the way you look and work with fellow human beings if you can ask that question on a daily basis. And it really does put you into this magical zone for critical self reflection. And in that zone of critical self reflection, You can be with your biases, your judgments, and reach for healthier, more constructive forms of working with human beings. And it's no small thing. It's my favorite cultural safety tool that I have is asking people to train themselves to ask themselves how are they being prejudiced. So I have this little fun example. By a show of hands, because I can see all of your faces with your cameras on. Just give me a hands up if you have ever been to the United States before. Show of hands. Okay, question for you all. Ever have a judgment about American culture? I rest my case. I rest my case. So we need to stop asking ourselves if we're prejudiced, and we just have to check in with those, right? We just have to check in with them. You don't have to like be open and a big bleeding heart and confess to the world that you have judgments about everybody's culture, because we have those judgments. We just have to check in with those. But we also need to help educate people when they think that, they don't have prejudice. No, we all have prejudice. Another tool I offer, and this is a very simple, very pragmatic one. So the first one is asking yourself how you're being prejudiced. The second tool I offer people is training yourself to constantly examine and re-examine your own language and your behavior. Your language and your behavior, especially if you are in those frontline services of providing direct care or interaction with the Indigenous community. If you can, again, mobilize your humility to say, oh, I don't know if that went okay. I don't know if I sounded okay. I don't know if I behaved appropriately. That's humility, to move away from the assumption that you're all safe, 100% safe. Safety has to be determined by, the people who we are working with, not ourselves. And that's why I always say sometimes our best at the end of the day is just being safer. But if you can constantly train yourself to examine and re-examine your language and your behavior, I do this in my own professional practice. I hold big spaces for a living, and I talk about very sensitive, very complex things like social justice, power, privilege, cultural awareness. And for me, it's practice, not perfection. And I know I'm going to make mistakes along the way. And so I'm constantly checking in with my team. And if you have the capacity to be able to do this, is another tool I would offer is developing debrief culture. So I debrief with my friends, my colleagues all the time. If I'm ever interacting in an area where I'm mobilizing my tools, I check in with my team and I say, did I sound okay? Did this email look okay? Hey, can I get you to write this report I'm working on? I want to see if my tone, if my language sounds okay. Even if I have to write a sensitive email, I will run it by members of my team and create that examination of our language and our behavior. If you can do that, you will constantly learn from it. It's a very dangerous zone when we are under the assumption that we are 100% safe in our language and our behavior, because then we're going to miss a lot in that. So we want to move away from that assumption and just constantly train ourselves to check in with those. Other tools that I offer. So feedback culture is a big one. Dr. Vicki Reynolds calls that cultivating cultures of critique, cultures of criticism. And we need cultures of critique and cultures of criticism if we want to learn and create learning opportunities. It's one thing to offer feedback. It's a whole other thing to receive feedback. So developing debrief culture in your teams and your organizations and in your professional practice, constantly seeking feedback, you'll be able to reflect from those. So that's at a very micro level. That's at a very interpersonal level, what individuals can do. Then you kind of like, if that was a circle, right? We could build up the circle to, okay, here's what your team can do. Here's what your organization could do. Here's what your policies that keep your organization can do. And then here's the broader societal things that we're kind of looking for. But interpersonally, that's what I'm often coaching people as some of the most pragmatic, practical tools that we all as professionals have access to. And they're my favorite ones.
Very nice. Can you say some words around like I know like feedback and like you mentioned humility. like shame often comes up, especially when you're looking at your own biases and you start to realize, oh my goodness, I think this way. A lot of times shame will come in and we do that cognitive dissonance thing where we explain it away and then we push it away and we don't examine it again. Can you say a few words about what folks can do when shame comes up for them around their behaviors, language, or biases that they might carry?
Yes, absolutely. So shame and fear are probably some of the two biggest emotional factors that come into play in this work of Indigenous cultural safety and humility. And again, they get such negative connotations through a Western worldview. And if we want to mobilize two-eyed seeing, it's important to know that through an Indigenous worldview, we don't skip over the uncomfortable parts. It's Western value system that really restricts emotions, and we restrict emotions all the time. And you know this if you've ever shed a tear in front of a friend or a colleague, right? Have you ever shed a tear in front of a friend or a colleague, right? And what are the first words that come out of your mouth when you shed a tear? Sorry, right? Oh, I'm sorry, right? You're bawling your face off and you're like, oh my God, I'm so sorry, right? Why do we apologize for something that's so human and so natural, right? So I think that's often unspoken in this work is that emotion and emotional learning is we can't cede our emotions at the door, right? It's a necessary part of this work, but it is worth mentioning that we come from this culture, this colonial culture, this Western culture, this corporate culture that really doesn't encourage us to have any emotions. So that's why we associate as fear as being bad. That's why we associate shame as a bad thing. And I'm like, no, those are human, very natural emotions. And they are often the biggest unspoken emotions in Western societies. And when they're unspoken, unaddressed, unacknowledged, unprocessed emotions, it creates an us and them mentality. Um, I say it's necessary. It's a necessary part of this work because as Indigenous peoples, we carry a lot of shame. We carry a lot of shame because of what's happened to us. We carry a lot of shame because uh, um, the system isn't really designed with us in mind. We carry a lot of shame because we hold on to a lot of hurt and imposter syndrome and cultural alienation. And we carry a lot of trauma. So there's a natural element of a huge degree of shame that we come from as Indigenous peoples. But at the same time, when shame comes up in conversation and in learning, usually it's shame for not knowing, shame for feeling responsible, shame for feeling a part of a culture or a country or an institution that had provided some colonial harms in the past. So my advice to folks is to try not to skip over the uncomfortable parts. The principle here is truth before reconciliation, truth before reconciliation, and you can't skip over the uncomfortable parts because if you do, our work at the end of the day will be superficial and uninformed. Um, Emotional learning is part of this process. It's very Western learning that has us just thinking up in here. Tell me the facts, tell me the figures, tell me what to do. Hold up, hold up, hold up. Right? We can't forget that you actually have three brains. You have three brains. You have the one between your ears, you have this brain right here, and then you have your gut. Dr. Gabor Mate says this. We have three brains here, here, and in our gut. And we have to use all three of those in alignment and in balance when we're learning, when we're doing cultural safety work, because your brain is only going to pick up the facts, the figures, the timelines, the very empirical, numerical parts of the equation. And you know, I know this because I work in so many different contexts and so many different professional domains where people are like, well, can we make an algorithm for this? I'm like, no, 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 it's not an algorithm kind of learning or journey and destination, right? It's also heart-centered and stomach-centered. And I say you need to use your gut too, because if you trust your gut, you know, if it feels wrong, it probably is. And if it feels like you should, then you probably should. And we trust this in our communities and in our cultures. When you're with us in community, it's like trust your gut. That's the brain. It has its own nervous system. Same with your heart and same with your brain. So my advice is when shame comes up is, and shame is actually so fascinating to learn about. Sorry, I'm really going to nerd out for a moment. I'm an emotional nerd. And so I'm going to nerd out over shame a little bit. Shame is so fascinating because it is the number one thing that's not talked about in our Canadian society. And who's famous for teaching the power of shame and vulnerability? Who's famous for that? I'm looking for somebody to kind of like flip the words. Brene Brown is famous. She's famous for teaching the power of shame. And her work and her research and her evidence, her data on shame as it shows up in everybody, right? Dads at home, dads at work, moms at home, moms at work, daughters, sons, uncles, leaders, bosses, children. We're all prone to shame because, and we don't talk about it in our colonial societies enough because it makes us, we think there's this conception that it makes us look weak, or that we're letting our own side down in some way to attack. So that's how I would that's my advice on working with shame, is if it comes up in conversation, try not to skip over it, try not to rush through it, try to name it, try to bring it in the space. And if you're a non-Indigenous person and you feel shame come up in the space, you could be a really great ally and role model for working with shame, not against it, not avoiding it, not pretending like it's not there. You can name it and bring it into the space and offer your own storytelling, your own experiences on how you've overcome or come to terms with shame. The same can be said for fear. Fear is a natural part of this work. Um, like I teach this every single day and I get afraid all the time. I'm afraid I'm going to say something wrong, do something wrong, and it's going to be an elder or a colleague like Harley who's going to be in the space and going to say, well, sorry, Len, I don't agree with you. Or this is how you should have said it, or this is how you should have done it. That fear is always in my heart. But I think that, again, fear is not a bad thing. Fear keeps you humble. Fear helps you develop boundaries, but we cannot let our fear become these unbreakable barriers from letting us do the good work that we really want to do at the end of the day. So we have to train ourselves to work with our fears and not let them be those barriers. I would be very worried if somebody showed up to one of our cultural safety training sessions, like Sanyas or something. They're like, okay, good, got it. No more questions. I'm a 100% culturally safe person. I'm going to do all this great work and I'm going to change the world. I'd be like, hold up, slow down. I'm very worried and concerned. So I think there's this natural, healthy amount of fear that we're always going to have. And I'm very worried for people that are not afraid, because that creates a very, dangerous orientation to the work. And there's one of my favorite teachings that I've been gifted along this learning journey so far is that if you have a fear of being corrected by Harley or by Len or by an elder or by a matriarch or another Indigenous colleague, please know that in our culture, that's typical in many Indigenous cultures across Turtle Island, is that if we correct you, we care about you. If we correct you, we respect you. Because if we didn't care about you or respect you, we would let you walk out of that situation and make the same mistake a million times over. So my elders have taught me, Len, before, if somebody corrects you, before you say sorry, say thank you. Thank you for the teaching that you can turn into a learning, and that learning only enhances our ability to do this work. Sorry, I have really long,
Oh,
winded answers.
I really appreciate how you connected shame and fear, and how you connected it to how you started this conversation around perfectionism. And it's Brené Brown's quote, right, where she says, if perfectionism is in the driver's seat, shame is riding shotgun, shame is riding shotgun, and fear is the backseat driver. That's
Yeah,
it's
I didn't know that quote, but there's this, the work in cultural safety, right, is so much like a constellation. It's a constellation of stars, and every now and then you start to see these patterns or these things that really link up to things that we're already kind of talking about. So I didn't know that. I feel like I'm quite familiar with Brene Brown's work, but I love that the shame and the perfectionism are so linked in this work.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And I do have one more question just because I think you're touching on it. And it has to do, you named it already earlier around complexity. Because sometimes we think, well, it's if we just do this, if we just put this policy in place, if we, just embrace this call to action, we'll be okay. But really, you said it that this is such a complex uh, issue and situation that we find ourselves in. How do you think about embracing complexity? What's your advice to folks to first recognize that it's complex, and then how do you be okay with complexity?
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's such a good question. And I think you're so right. I think these are complex systems. They're systems that were designed overnight. They weren't designed overnight. They were designed over a long period of time. And now, so we have this house, right, that's built in this country, our institutions, our public institutions. And with all of the complexities that went into it, the change, how I deal with the change, how I advise change for these very large organizations, these very large institutions that are quite old, not as old as us as Indigenous peoples, but they're quite old. Um, as I say, small incremental changes over a period of time. That's how I look at the complexity of it all. And I only know this through just different problem solving in different areas that I've been exposed to in my professional practices. Whenever you have a huge complex problem, you just have to break it off into chunks and do these small incremental changes. And I love this quote by Gabriel George from Tsleil-Waututh First Nation. I invited him to speak at one of our reconciliation gatherings, the last September 30th event. And he said, all these little bits, right? All these little bits that we do, territory acknowledgements, policy changes here, holidays here, these things, they don't seem like a lot, but all these little bits add up to a much broader whole. So we have to have that faith and we have to have that understanding that these are small incremental changes over a period of time. Oh, I love that radical incrementalism. But that's how we deal. That's how I look at the complexities of it all, and I also look towards uh, the intergenerational change that this is. We think that this is very new work. We think that this is very emerging work, which it really is. But that's for Canada. For us as Indigenous peoples, for Harley to be here, for myself to be here, the only way we could possibly be here is because of a lot of small incremental changes that had to happen so we could be here today with all of you like-minded, like-hearted folks and individuals, allies and champions for this work. And so I really lean heavily on my own ancestral teachings that our ancestors had to have faith, had to have hope that the small incremental steps we put together is for the longer journey that is to come. Our job is just to do as much as we can with the time that we're given so the people that will one day replace us, will inherit a much better position, a much better department, a much better organization, a much better society than when we inherited it. And that's how I think I've learned that from just looking back at the work that our ancestors did. There's been a lot of, radical incrementalism over a long period of time. But what I'm driven by today is the motivation for this work, the inspiration for this work. I've been working in Indigenous education for the last 25 years. And 25 years ago, it was nothing compared to where we are at today. I remember working when I first started working in the education system, we had to fight tooth and nail to get into spaces, to be heard, to be seen, to be recognized. And now the fact that I own a company that does this work and we can't keep up to the demand of people who want to learn, who want to change, who want to transform. We have like a month-long wait list. That fills up my cup. That gives me my juice to be able to do this work. It's easy to get caught up in the doom and the gloom of it all and the complexity. But don't forget to fill up your cup too, that it's small incremental changes over a long period of time and that it's only coming faster and faster and faster because now we have the country that is getting behind us, not just Indigenous peoples, because for over many generations, it's just been Indigenous peoples doing this work. that's how I kind of look at the complexity of it all, is having this faith and this hope. And I keep coming back to those two words because it was an elder in Kwakiutl First Nation, Maggie, who shared that with me. She called it FOPE. She's like, Len, you need FOPE. I'm like, what is that? And she's like, it's your faith and your hope together that this work is happening, and it's already happening. I also lean on Justice Murray Sinclair's quote of reconciliation is inevitable. And so we just get to be a part of it. We don't have to, we get to be a part of the change.
Wow. Beautiful words to end this conversation. Thank you so much, Len.